in the ordering of the Arab and Iranian regions. Um, she is, we're hoping she is an expert. She comes from Jordan and is at the University of Kent at Canterbury. And she's a lecturer in international law and legal theory. And her special research is on the intersection of public and economic international law. She's also uh, a legal consultant to Palestine. Now, we've got the best part of 90 minutes, and so that's plenty of time for the talk and for us to interact with questions and a discussion. And let's get started. All right,
Uh,
Shahd.
yes, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And once again, I am super sorry. I had a prior email rant, prior meeting rant to this one, and then spent 10 minutes a little bit, all over the place. So thank you so much for your kindness and for
Well,
hosting me.
we're quite happy to have waited for you.
Thank you. That's an honor. So if I can start with the larger picture, and then what I'll do is I kind of paint the larger picture of at least how I would approach these shifts that we are talking about, and then to kind of bring into the small picture. As you're all very well aware, we're kind of now in a limbo state with the Iran-US war, and there are a lot of questions on what does this mean going forward and how do we look at it? So the first thing that I would say is that I would build on a perspective from something called world systems theory. And that is something that is taken on by authors like Samir Amin in his book on chaos, as well as his other works on the political economy. And there he explains this idea that if we are to look at the world as, let's say, the accumulation of power as well as capital that has happened during colonization and after, as being centered in what he calls the core of the world order. And that core is, as we know it today, consists of the US, the UK, European states, as well as Australia, New Zealand, or at least these are where let's say, the winners of the last stage of history in the post-World War II order, and as well as China and Russia being within that core. And that core is not simply a state core. It's kind of a bit it's distortive to think of it like that. It's more of the elite as well as the states supporting these elites existing in these core. And of course, we can see the overall space of these spaces being economically developed, colonial histories, as well as what generally we could call accumulated power and capital. So, and then on the semi-periphery are the states that have developed economies, but not to a high level. So, for example, like India and Brazil. So those states have some power in the game. And then there is the periphery states who are not very much powerful in the game and who are deemed to be in a very dependent state. So, and what we're seeing is that if we are to look at history from what we call the longue durée or the long perspective on history, we reach or also from the science of history, we reach a point where the dynamics of this core change with every round of history. And what we are looking at now is a deep change in that overall dynamic. And with that, we are noting that ever since, so we have the Second World War ending, and with the Second World War, you had those core states kind of take on their throne in what we kind of call the post-World War II order. And with that came the Cold War, so we had two major powers in the core, and that's what Samir Amin calls intra-core rivalry, so rivalry between big powers inside of the core, and that opened up space for states in the periphery to kind of choose sides, more or less. Or if you're unhappy with the power from here, you can choose that other power. So it gave a little bit of a breathing space. But then after the end of the Cold War, we had the US as the predominant hegemon of the world. Whatever the US says, the whole world functions along that line. And sadly enough, we saw a unipolar world. And with that also, ever since the Second World War, it's really important to note that most wars only happened in peripheral states. So in people who are very underprivileged and precarious, most of the wars happened there. So the Balkans would also be considered precarious. Meanwhile, with Ukraine, that was kind of the first time that we see a little bit of a shift where a semi-peripheral space enters into war. So why would we say that, and why is that important? It's important because what the analysts who are in that school of thought believe is that we are at a dawn of a new era in history, where the US is no longer the primary kind of power that says what gets to happen and what doesn't get to happen. And that a lot of people would argue is just simply that observation is a historical almost inevitability, because no power on earth can be able to be that big and then stay that big and be able to call all the shots. And really, there's so many shots that are called by either we core states, but also the elite, what we call the transnational elite class. So the transnational elite class would shape, so for example, in international law, international investment law, international trade law, in public international law, what is peace and security and what is not peace and security. So in short, the more power that you have, the more capacity that you get to shape the rules of the game. And the rules of the game on a global level are rigged towards the transnational elite class in a way that is unprecedented, in the sense that the rules of investment law make sure that we extract money from peripheral state at really cheap prices. Trade law does almost the same, in the sense that it doesn't allow peripheral states to develop their economies. And then when previously colonized states come and say, we want reparations, the core responds and says, hell no. So that's kind of where we see that we have been in. And the war now, as it happens now with Iran, kind of is signaling a shift in that change. And a good part of that shift also comes in the light that Europe has lost its productive capacity. At the start of the Second World Order, we had seen a very big rise and re-centralization of Europe at the core of the production as well as the rulemaking of the global economy. But little by little, we saw production capacity go towards China, towards peripheral states, and the rest of the world. Meanwhile, what is left in Europe is military power. So we are witnessing a very big shift whereby where there is a realization that the only power there is left is more or less that space, at least to tell the rules of the global economy, because otherwise the others now have a bit more power. Sorry, I started with the larger picture so that I could kind of start to zoom in into the smaller picture. And when we look at it from the smaller picture, we see that we have also seen a big eradication of the use of what we call soft power tools. So in order to keep the core dominant, there was a lot of use of soft power, which is, for example, the use of the law as a tool of coercion and distortion, which is a very classic thing if you really look at how international law, for example, was used, in the sense that instead of going to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and colonizing it, what was done is to put international investment agreements that would take out all of its money using the law, but also there was a claim to moral superiority in the sense that states like the UK and the US would say that we have this much power because we are more liberal and human rights loving. And they would keep that, let's say, facade of loving human rights, but at the back facilitating economic systems that are really built on exploiting the others. What we see now is the kind of taking off that mask and back to a very fascistic mentality of militarization, as well as outright dehumanization of the other in a very classic tone, so to speak. So we see, for example, politicians like Trump or far-right politicians in Europe, as well as elite in the world, try to take on this very militaristic tone of "we will prevail." And here you see that sense of the feeling that things are about to change, and the only way we can keep things the way they are is by fighting, is by expanding the military power. So we're seeing a huge push towards militarization in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in the US. So, and that is also comes hand in hand with the growth of the military industry and its privatization. Weapons are sold like we sell any other commodity. So, and a lot of states are very much okay with doing things outside the remits of the law. And perhaps we could say that Gaza was that moment. Gaza was the moment when states bluntly started to reject international law, reject its application, and reject its mere premises. And it became also clear to the global public that when international law is invoked in relation to people who are precarious or seen as or whose death or killing is normalized within the overall political system, international law doesn't have a weight. So, and that kind of very big attack on the international legal legitimacy has caused a very, very big crisis in the discipline. A lot of people in my discipline now are talking about the death of international law, or did we reach a moment where all that was built ever since the Second World War is over, or not? And we could say that the graveyard for that was Gaza. We witnessed a live stream genocide, and nothing changed. Keir Starmer was still defending it. The US was still defending it. Europe was still defending it. And up until this moment, we still have states that would presume good faith in what are otherwise very clearly violations of international law. So we have this kind of changing world system, and with that we have also a shift in the tactics that are being used from a liberal type of human rights narrative that masks systematic violence to outright violence in front of us, to complete just use of militarization. So we see the drums of war kind of drumming, and we see a very clear red alert for more violence coming, and sadly more violence that will bear itself on the bodies of the people who are most precarious. So that's the bigger picture. Let's come back to the smaller picture. So we started by saying that in what happened in Gaza since 2023 up until this moment has kind of been the last killing stroke for international law. To keep things in mind now, or to kind of imagine how Gaza looks like at the moment, it has come from bad to worse, and it has come from a bloodbath into very prolonged way of killing people. And the fact that the world has signed a decree to accept that the fact that, for example, the UK would come and say that things like the Board of Peace are all right, even though the Board of Peace, instead of giving us the primary principles of international law like accountability, self-determination, reparations, and all of that, in accordance, of course, with what the International Court of Justice said, in the sense that Israel's occupation of the whole of Gaza is illegal, full stop, and Israel doesn't get to invoke right of self-defense against an area that where itself is an aggressor, because at the end of the day, if you are an aggressor against the people, you can't say that you're defending yourself against their own resistance against your own unlawful power. That's the logic that the International Court of Justice said. And Judge Hilary Charlesworth reminded us of it in her own separate opinion. So what we have at the moment is the states coming in and saying it's absolutely fine to create a board of peace, and the board of peace is a new colonial entity. Instead of giving the Palestinian people what they deserve, instead of that, Trump is proposing what I could only describe as a dystopian imaginary of the future that is business led, and that seeks to kind of put a facade of the neutrality of business in the face of in the face, or to kind of hide and mask what is behind it. And what is behind it is the exploitation and expropriation of the land of the Palestinians, the exploitation of the Palestinians, as well as their own dispossession, and not allowing them to determine their own destiny, or giving them their own basic human rights. And that's it. And you could see in that small case of Gaza almost kind of a microcosm of the bigger shifts in the world, in the sense that Israel has gone so bad, it has crossed such red lines that it can no longer go back. And that's what we call the Gaza doctrine, in the sense of normalizing the sadistic live stream devaluation of a human life, as well as we see a parallel here in the environment, in the sense that environmental discourse as well is being met with not of sheer overlooking of the question of legality or the question of international law. BP is, expanding. All of these oil and gas companies are very happy to keep on expanding their own quite accumulation of capital and power. So you could see the fact that you could see that the system wants to maintain itself despite the fact that the material conditions are changing, and it will defend itself in the most horrendous and sadistic way possible, instead of accepting that it needs to share power with others, instead of accepting that perhaps this is the time to kind of allow more of an equilibrium in global power sharing. So from Gaza, what we are now seeing. What we're now seeing is the normalization of this massive violence, as well as indeed the fact that even yesterday I heard that there was a rodent attack like rodent outbreak in Gaza. Exactly, on top of everything, people have to deal now with rodents, and indeed, over 100 people share one bathroom, no self, and Israel is not letting in nutritious food, so people can eat crisps, and people can eat sugary drinks, but they cannot eat meat or find vegetables in the market. And most of people are not, none of the tools required for rebuilding Gaza are entering. So we're talking about 2 million people, over 2 million people who are living in the most dire of conditions, traumatized out of genocide. We have over 10,000 amputees, over 25,000 orphans, and we even have cases of child abduction and human trafficking now, in the sense that some Israeli companies are facilitating very shady ways of taking out children from Gaza elsewhere. And what they're trying to do is to normalize the state and open up the door for immigration slowly for Palestinians. So make it absolutely unbearable, so that the moment they have a window to leave, they would leave. Nevertheless, I will come back to kind of the difference between the kind of the blind spot of the Israelis and the Americans here, and why that will not work. But before I go to that, let me go to also to look at the image in Lebanon. So Israel, as a settler colonial entity, and its existence in the region has really facilitated the interest of core and transnational elite states and empire, if you want to call it, for the longest time ever. Israel played a very pivotal role in the region of supporting oppressors, as well as supporting foreign intervention. Everything from the war in Iraq to also the changes in how the Gulf states are. And if you're interested, we can talk a little bit more about the Gulf states and how and what on earth is that structure. and as well as, of course, the civil war in Lebanon, and indeed it has a hand to play with the dictatorships all across the region, starting with the Egyptian one and the Jordanian one. So with that idea taken into consideration, what would happen is that that settler entity, the only way it would be able to exist is to expand its project. And here we see the fact that it reached a point where it can no longer be able to sustain that project. Instead, and what it's doing now is simply what we call a blazed land. Like kind of just murder whatever it can, clear out whatever lands it can. So in Lebanon, what we find is, again, Israel has for the longest time ever claimed south of Lebanon to be a part of its expansionist project. And indeed, as you all know, the Lebanese fought against the Israelis and managed to take them out of the land in 2006. And for the Lebanese people, that is the proudest moment ever. And now what Israel is trying to do is to normalize a new status quo of annexation in the south of Lebanon. If you haven't seen the news really, or if you haven't been keeping up, what happened is that the systematic destruction of all the villages on the borders. So what they're doing is that they're as they go, all of the houses are being destroyed, all of the so it's a very much Gaza again played. And on average, even during the ceasefire, we're having up to around 12 people killed a day. Without the ceasefire, we would have had over 100 people killed a day. And this is a new level of savagery that historically we haven't reached before. And you could see that Israel is kind of trying to normalize that level of violence. And this is the fear that we have in such moments of global change, which is massive violence. And what we see now is a normalization of that massive violence. How? That is through what we call a shifting, the normalization of a higher margin of violence. So if you make people watch enough blood and misery, the spectrum of how much normal violence is kind of changes. And instead of, for example, it being not acceptable for 4 people to be killed, it becomes 50 people, 100 people. So now Israel has managed to kind of shift that window of how much is normal into a very violent level. And sadly, social media overexposure, as well as the complicity of the media, has played a very big role in making what is otherwise very sadistic forms of violence normalized. And of course, this can be evidenced most clearly in the targeting of journalists. So we've had last week the killing of the journalist Amal, who was reporting, and she was under the rubble for 5 hours, and Israel just didn't allow the ambulances to reach her. So she ended up dead. And of course, so far we have, I think, over 23 Lebanese journalists, and in Gaza we had over 200 journalists who were killed. Adding, of course, the amount of people that I heard were murdered who were emergency workers, ambulance drivers, as well as people who work with the Red Cross is insane. I myself at least know 3 people who know people who have relatives who worked in the emergency services who were killed. So you could see this kind of this entry of that form of overall violence. So Gaza, Lebanon, and now onto Iran. So with Iran, there is a very interesting way to navigate it, because what the US and Israel tried to do at first is to use a very classic iteration of the duty to protect, or the idea that you get to intervene in another country in the name of saving those people. I always tell my students that that's a red flag. When anyone says I'm going to save someone else, especially a state that is representative of, elite interest, presume bad faith. And indeed, this is the case. Iran, with all of the with all of its faults, at the end of the day, is a sovereign state, and it's a sovereign state that actually is a welfare state. So it has free access to healthcare, free health access to education, and also it rejected something. The most important thing to understand about it is that it rejected dependency. It rejected the rules of the international economic order. It rejected the idea that it has to become dependent on the global financial system, which is an unequal system. Because the moment you accept the rules of the game, you really lose economic sovereignty, in the sense that Iran has a very strong industry. It's capable to feed its own people. It has sovereignty over natural resources. And that is something that is very much looked down upon in the core periphery dynamics. For example, compared with Iraq, Iraq used to be like that, but the moment the Iraq war happened, what we had is what we call the de-Baathification of Iraq, or what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, which is basically you go into the economy and you sell everything that the state owns completely, and you give it all to big corporations, and indeed that means that the profit of those things ends up, or the economy of the state ends up being designed in a way that first and foremost services foreign investors over local investors, the local people in general. You could see that most of countries in the region they are very much dependent and lacking in sovereignty over natural resources. For example, Jordan, where I grew up, according to our trade agreement with the US, we cannot grow our own wheat. So we can't use our own local seeds of wheat, so that we buy from US companies those products, which means that if we decide to rebel, or if we want to disagree with the US on a specific agreement, what it can do is day number one, we will lose access to bread. And that way we're able to be coerced. Iran is outside of that system, and that's a good reason of why it has been such a adversary. Also, Iran is the only country in the region that still has an active military power and stands up against US and Israeli total hegemony in the region. So, and those are, of course, all reasons to put it down. So in that end, if Iran loses its power as a sovereign state, we are inevitably looking at the loss of Palestine for the next 10 years. In the sense that without the military power of Iran as a deterrent power in the region, what will happen is that Israel will be capable of taking its power further, and this sadistic mode of operation will have more life until something else happened that we would be able to contest it. Of course, with that being said, as you're all very much aware, under international law, the invasion of Iran was an illegal war of aggression, which is a violation of the UN Charter. And again, here we see a lot of states did say that word, illegal aggression, but most did not. And of course, what Iran tried to do here is to weaponize its own, rather than its power in the political economy, it weaponized its geography. And that is, so to speak, for the poorer or the smaller states of the world, this has been a quite long-term guerrilla tactic of using your own geography to maintain your own independence, or to challenge someone else seeking to control you. So with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, what Iran is trying to do is to fight in that power struggle and seek to maintain its own sovereignty in the region, in its own state. Meanwhile, what we are seeing is that the U.S. it's a changing position, but the reality is that a lot of people are making a lot of money out of this. So it could also, at the moment, the oil and gas industry, BP has just registered historical profits in the first quarter. And meanwhile, the people who will suffer the most from this economically are indeed the working class. And this is sadly the design of the world that we exist in, which is crisis still means profit, and then status quo still means profit. And that's kind of war profiteering is inked into the normal status quo of the world that we live in. And now I will go to and finish on this point, which is how is Israel, how are the Israel and the U.S. Failing this, and what are they not seeing? What they're not really seeing and what they're really trying to fight against with the sadistic power, especially also the same sadistic military power and police power that we're seeing in the UK here against people who are speaking out against the war, and the same kind of whip and lash of that is the fact that the people and the global majority, for the first time, I would say, ever since a very long time, I don't know if we could accurately say since the Second World War or since the 1960s, is able to kind of identify the idea that they are against specific parts of the rules of the game. And here specifically understanding that Gaza, let's say, has shed power relations bare, and people are growing in consciousness and understanding how power works, how capital works, and there's global momentum for organizing. There's global momentum for working class organization. There's growing momentum and discussions like the ones that we are having here today, and at the end of the day, what the US and Israel most likely keep out of the calculation is the will of the people as well as their agency, as well as their own clarity and need to maintain their own dignity in that. So in Iran, they expected that the country will fall directly. However, and luckily enough, the Iranian people had enough perception to understand that regardless of whatever internal problems that we have, foreign intervention is never the solution. So when someone like it's the same as having internal problems with a very patriarchal father, you would very much. Have a lot of issues with that patriarchal father, but then when someone comes and tries to steal your whole house, what you try to that the priority then is maintaining that, and that they didn't calculate. They didn't calculate that people actually would stand united. And leftist movements, Me Too leaders who are Me Too leaders in Europe who are Iranian directly said no to foreign intervention, and that unity. What they didn't expect is that people all across the world would be standing in solidarity with oppressed people. What they didn't expect is that I would be romantic to call it more or less the truth of this justice or the injustice that has been done to the people of the region really has also shook the core of the current status quo that we live in. And that itself signals that change. It signals the idea that we are at a dawn or maybe the last bit of a world order and something else is being born. And in this moment, we need to be like, it's a very dark moment. Like when I speak like this among my own people, I am called way too far of a dreamer. But at this moment is indeed, I believe, historically speaking, the moment that we build and dream as much as we can, that we work with as much hope as we can in order to learn from the lessons that we have, to advocate for international rules of order that are premised on economic equality and premised on the idea that war will keep on happening unless we give justice, and justice becomes a core value of the system. And sadly enough, that's not what we currently have, and people are somehow, I think, joining ranks. And perhaps the biggest challenge here now, and we don't know if the next round of history, how it will look like. And if you're interested, I highly recommend Asli Bali, ASLIBALLI, who's a professor at Yale, who talks a lot about this change. And she says that we don't know how it will look like. It might go from worse to worse. The new order might, also look bad. But the idea is that it really matters what we build now, what we seek to imagine in the future, how we fill that vacuum, and the hope is that that the Middle East is capable of now, or we don't call them Middle East, sorry, we call it West Asia. And the reason why I insisted on that is because it's the Middle East when you're looking at it from Europe. So that means that Europe is the center of our gaze, which it shouldn't be. So the hope here is that we are able to kind of unify the voices and work towards that, give clarity of perception as much as possible, and indeed, as much as possible, call out and work against the mass normalization of what we now call the Gaza doctrine, which is that a sense of absolute brutality and sadism with a big sense of dehumanization of the other. Thank you, and I apologize if I took too long in my, introductory.
No,